And now, to introduce our 2 o'clock Interfaith lecture series here in the Hall of Philosophy, where this week we have been presenting the theme, Religion and Statecraft, the Soft Power of Global Peacemaking. Our distinguished guests today are our already much beloved leader, the 18th president of the Chautauqua Institution, Michael Hill, and his dear friend and former associate in global peacemaking, Daryl Weinert, who is board chair of Youth for Understanding, the organization which Michael formerly led as president and chief executive officer. I trust that you can see already why their conversation this afternoon is such an appropriate vehicle for bringing this week's conversation to a practical and inspiring closure. The title for Michael and Daryl's conversation today is The Soft Power of Global Peacemaking, One Young Person at a Time. We are grateful to the Carnahan-Jackson Religious Lectureship for providing support for today's Interfaith lecture. We are delighted that Michael and Daryl can be with us for this special and important conversation. And so I now present to you Chautauqua's 18th president, Michael Hill, who will do the honor of introducing his good friend and compeer in global peacemaking, Daryl Weinert.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you for coming out on a somewhat steamy Friday. I'm reminded that I used to live in Washington and that it's cooler here, so I'd encourage you to channel that as well. It's a real treat for me to be here with Daryl and his family, Kathy, Nate, and Olivia, who have also traveled with me through Cuba on people-to-people exchanges. And actually, that was the last time I saw the whole family together, is when we were bouncing around Havana, talking about how the United States and Cuba might find better ways to come together. It's also a real honor for me to get a chance to introduce Daryl. As Maureen indicated, he is my immediate past boss. It's much more fun spending time with him now than when I called and wondered what was on his mind. But Daryl, in addition to what was mentioned about him at Youth for Understanding, is an associate vice president at the University of Michigan, and so he always gets excited when he sees Wolverine gear out there and spots it like a hawk and tells me and reminds me that they are everywhere. But what often doesn't get talked about in the role that Daryl played in partnership with me at Youth for Understanding is the deep, intense care for young people that he held really as a crucible. And as you might imagine, having a few thousand kids come from 60 plus countries in any given year, things happen with teenagers. Things happen with teenagers when they're with their mom and dad and then transport them into other countries. And Daryl was always the first call when something went incredibly right or incredibly wrong. So it's a delight for me to be able to share this time and space with him and to be in this pulpit and not talk to you about the health of the lake, your street trash, or any of the other things that we normally talk about when I'm up here in this lectern. So I welcome Daryl to join me up here. And I'll just want to frame it before we enter into conversation together, because I've had a number of people ask me this week, well, really what is soft power? And I know other speakers have mentioned this, but it shows up 27 years ago with a Professor Joseph Nye who said, it's the ability of a country to persuade others to do what it wants without force or coercion. And he further notes that sometimes that power with others can be more effective than having power over others. I think we've seen in our speakers, both from CSIS and in the Interfaith lectures that we've held here, that we see a major shift happening in global dynamics, moving from hard power, where countries are trying to force change, to soft power, where citizen movements actually have a greater ability to persuade those movements. And so I think it's a particularly interesting time for us to talk about the role that student exchange plays in that, because it's tried to be, for most of its existence, a citizen-to-citizen diplomacy movement that's changed things. So I'm going to start out by just asking Daryl to tell the Chautauqua audience a little about himself his affiliation with Youth for Understanding and a little bit about the history of the organization.
All right. Thank you, Michael. No, it's a thrill to be here. I'm actually here just to thank Chautauqua for taking Michael. No, I'm being facetious. That was not fair.
But deserved, it's okay.
Yeah, so I'm hoping and imagining some of you in the audience maybe even have direct experience with Youth for Understanding in some fashion in the past. Either you went on an exchange through us or you've hosted a student through us. Because it's a pretty amazing organization. It was founded back in 1951 in Ann Arbor, Michigan, actually. I keep trying to convince Michael that all paths lead through Ann Arbor, Michigan. But it was founded by a woman by the name of Rachel Andreessen, who was executive director of the Washtenaw County Council of Churches at that point. And she had traveled with her husband over to Europe a few years earlier and seen kind of the results and the devastation and the destruction that had resulted from World War II. And then she had a chance a few years later to be in Amsterdam on the day, I think it was for a World Council of Churches gathering, on the day that the electricity and the lights were turned back on in Amsterdam. And I think a light bulb went off in her mind on that date as well, because she came back and had the vision that one of the greatest ways potentially to heal the wounds of that incredible conflict was to do it through young people and to bringing young people into cultures other than their own to breed understanding. And it started with students from Germany coming, high school age students from Germany coming to the state of Michigan. I think it was 75 of them in that first group. And she somehow miraculously found homes that would take all of them in and high schools that they could study for the year and learn about what was most immediately a great adversary. I think we all forget now, looking back on it, but the United States and Germany had just been at war. And I know she had tremendous concerns at that point of how would this work, bringing German students into these homes in Michigan. But it worked fabulously, and I know when that cohort of students left, it was an amazing event, and it inspired her and others to start doing this on a regular basis. And slowly over time, Youth for Understanding grew and grew, and ultimately grew to the point where it needed to move its headquarters to Washington, D.C., because it had truly become a national organization in the United States. And we now have over 60 partner YFU organizations around the globe that basically coordinate student exchanges of every permutation you could imagine for about 5,000 students a year who are going to live in a different culture and experience, that have that deep experience. So my own journey with YFU started because I was a YFU student when I was in high school in 1980, and I went to Spain on program. And as I often say, it literally and figuratively changed my life and set me on a very deliberate, I guess it turned out to be, but very incredible path. And we'll probably talk about that more as we go on. But so I was an exchange student with YFU, then I went to college, frankly lost touch with YFU. When I ended up getting some real jobs and having some real income, I did start then making a small donation each year to Youth for Understanding. And then honestly, I still don't know how or why, but in 2011, the then president and CEO of YFU called me up out of the blue. My day job, as Michael said, is at the University of Michigan. And I was very honored to get that call that they were asking me to join their board of trustees. And then, kind of surprisingly, about a year later, got roped into becoming the chairman of the board of trustees. But it's been a fabulous experience, and I wouldn't obviously be on this stage if this had not happened. But we'll talk more about really what these student exchanges really mean on a personal level, but then ultimately really on a global level.
Yeah, so you mentioned Dr. Andreessen, who I used to laugh following great leaders, which I had the privilege of doing here at Chautauqua, following Tom Becker and then certainly Dan Bratton, who I remembered as the first Chautauqua president I knew. There used to be this massive portrait of Rachel Andreessen outside my office, and every morning I would turn the corner and swear she was telling me not to screw it up. We moved the portrait eventually. But But she went on to be nominated for a Nobel Peace Prize for her work at Youth for Understanding. So why do you think that is? And when you were on a journey in Spain, did you think as a young person that you were participating in peacemaking? I mean, a lot of people say, oh, it's just kids going back and forth to different cultures, but why is exchange in and of itself part of soft power?
So that's a really good question, and I'll be blunt that when I went on program, I had no idea I was going on a peace mission. I was a teenager, for God's sake. You know, I think it was a very complex set of reasons I was going on exchange, and actually, you know, leading up to joining all of you today, I've really been thinking a lot more about what did motivate me to go do that. So. Really, I mean, on a personal level, I will say I am the youngest of 4 children in my family. I grew up in the Detroit area again. And this was during the turbulent 1960s and early 1970s. And as the youngest of 4 kids, I mean, I kid you not, I grew up in All in the Family. For those of you that remember that television show. I mean, my parents were very conservative Republicans. My siblings, my 3 older siblings, all had a taste of the turbulent 1960s. My brother came to the campus of the University of Michigan in the late 1960s and experienced, I mean, it was, you know, life-changing for them. There was an excitement in the air, but a lot of strife and discord in the air. And I vividly remember, for example, I was 9 years old in 1972 during the Nixon-McGovern race. And I would one night be watching the Republican convention, cheering with my parents that Richard Nixon had been nominated by the Republican Party. And then the next day, I kid you not, I was surreptitiously delivering George McGovern literature with my brother in neighborhoods in the suburb of East Detroit where I grew up. And you have to understand, this was, I mean, for a 9-year-old, this was just discordant. It was like, what's going on here? These are people I love. I love my parents, and they have a set of political views and a view of the world and life. And I have these siblings who I love and care about, and they have a very different view of the world and of life. And I think I raise that here because I think as a young person, for me, it's been a challenge in life to really reconcile that, and I'm still grappling with that. And obviously as a country, we're still grappling with that. And we'll talk a little bit more about why I think what YFU does is important to address that challenge. But you know, these were good people on both sides, yet they had tremendous differences, and I think that created a spark in me that wanted to go discover and to really understand the world and people's motivations. And youth exchange, I think, ended up being a natural outgrowth of that. I found out about YFU in my Spanish class in high school. A rep from YFU came to our class, and I still remember it, and I still have it up in our attic, the little fold-out cartoon map of the world with all the programs, all the countries you could go to in the globe. And I remember perusing that map and then trying to convince my parents that I should be allowed to go do this. And then ultimately did it, going to Spain. But it was a life-changing event, and it was a start, I think, on this path to reconciling in my own mind human beings and the differences that we have.
So what do you think has changed since the time you went on exchange? You described a very specific moment in U.S. history, and certainly we spent a lot of time talking about the pressures that are on organizations like ours, are on like Chautauqua, that value civil discourse in a discordant time. Why should students still do that? What are the challenges that you're seeing for young people, and are they different than when you went?
I think they're different, and I think they're the same. To me, why I think it's important, and firmly believe this, that you truly do not understand your own culture until you get out of your own culture. There's just no way around it. There's just so much baggage associated in your own culture as you're living it that you don't even know what's a part of my culture, what's not, what's core human values, what's just cultural. For me, that started with going to live in Spain with a Spanish family, and starting to really figure out, we don't do that in the United States. I wonder why they do that in Spain. Or the aha moments of, boy, that's just like in the US, and that's how people react to things. So I think on a fundamental level, it's that ability to just understand yourself, you need to get outside of yourself, in effect. And even, frankly, English language. I didn't understand English grammar till I started learning another language. Because again, your native tongue you grow up with is just, that's the way it is. And then when you start learning another language, you start understanding grammatical structure. And I think there's a corollary to that in your own culture as well. And again, it catapulted me into, I ended up then, as you know, Michael, joining the Peace Corps and living for 2.5 years in Nepal. And I ended up doing a volunteer program in Eastern Europe after the wall fell for a year. And, I have craved, I guess, over time, trying to develop my own understanding by basically getting outside of my comfort zone. And I think, again, that's still relevant for young people today. Now, is it different? Absolutely. When I was on exchange, you didn't call home. You couldn't text home instantly. You couldn't be Skyping with your parents. So I think on some level that's very different because you truly were isolated and you were out there. And obviously that's not as true today. And I think that's a challenge for folks who go on exchanges. You have to make sure yourself that you separate enough from your home environment to truly have the immersive experience. So I think it's different, but at a fundamental level, I think it's still pretty much the same, that going abroad is truly eye-opening.
So one of the challenges I know that we face and that we hear from others is that this notion of immersing yourself in a culture in person isn't necessary because of the advent of technology. Because you can watch a YouTube video about what it's like to be in Spain, or you can Skype with someone over there. Why do you think it's still essential as a part of this global notion of peacemaking? Again, Andreessen's nominated for the Nobel Peace Prize because of some of the things you talked about in uniting German and US kids, but is that even necessary today given the way that technology connects us?
Yes, I think it's necessary, and I think all of those other tools are fabulous and have the potential to help people on a journey of discovery, but it only gets you so far. Again, I think YFU and most of the volunteers in the community within YFU would still vehemently argue that it's hard to substitute for the immersive experience of actually living with a family and going to school. You are not a tourist anymore. You are not just seeing things on the surface. And that's not to disparage tourism or Skyping with someone from another country and discussing things. But the immersive experience is really profound. And I think that's why we would still believe that this plays an important role in building understanding between cultures.
So just recently, the Soft Power 30 came out. It's a global ranking of soft power, and I was thrilled to see that YFU was in there for its virtual exchange program. And we've talked a lot about in-person immersive experiences. Talk to us a little bit about how organizations like YFU and others are thinking about the use of technology. Why get into virtual exchanges, given what you just said, and what's the strategy and the hope there?
So again, I think we need to embrace these new cyber tools, despite what you might have heard this morning in the scary presentation on cybersecurity. There are still countries on our globe that it's too dangerous to send a kid to go have an immersive experience, or countries that really aren't going to allow their kids to leave their country and go experience another culture. So I think it's another tool in our repertoire that we're embracing for that reason. I think we would argue that the programs we're building around virtual exchange, the support structures we're building around our virtual exchange experiences they're mediated and are provided ancillary support to the folks who are participating in the virtual exchanges, make them as good as they can be. Again, I'm not going to argue it's a substitute for the fully immersive experience, but in some, again, conflict areas around the globe, that's the best we're going to do, and we might as well try it. Again, YFU's roots were based on countries that had recently been at conflict and really needed this dose of understanding. And to be true to our roots, we need to continue on that path. So I think we've developed a pretty good approach to virtual exchange, and I think it should be part of the repertoire.
Well, it's interesting, the parallels, because we've certainly been having a conversation at Chautauqua about there's only so many folks that can take in the experience here in the summer. It's cost prohibitive in some ways, so is an exchange program. And I think some of the stories that have come out of there have been really fantastic. I think about the work that our colleague was doing around Syrian refugee camps and in Tunisia, and linking kids up who would never ever have gotten out of their own countries, or for cultural reasons it wasn't acceptable. Young women that had curfews because of their cultural contexts, and were able to link up with kids in the United States to realize that they were more similar than different, have been powerful. You've been in this a while, you did it yourself. What are your favorite stories that you've seen about how kids are changing the world? Because I continue to believe that this is so much more than an exchange program. It is what Soft Power 30 says, a critical part of peacemaking for governments.
Actually, I'm going to throw that one back at you, because you were the president and CEO, and you lived more directly recently some of these student experiences. What are some of your best memories of just amazing student stories?
Board chairs get to do this to their presidents. Well, early on, so my first year as I was president at YFU, and I didn't go on exchange. I got the experience later by having an exchange son who's sitting over there, and I love every opportunity to make him feel mortified. So hi, Alan, in his last week here in the United States at Chautauqua. But I remember one of my colleagues coming into my office saying that there's a program called the YES program that Senators Kennedy and Lugar created after 9/11, with the belief that if people from disparate faiths understood one another, that maybe, just maybe, some of the terrorist acts that have been plaguing the country under the name of religion might not have happened. And it's always been my favorite program. It's one of the reasons my assistant gave me a book that's The Art of the Quran, because she knew that I saw the biggest transformation when Americans interacted with kids from Muslim-based countries. And so they came into my office that first placement cycle where we were placing kids, and we were sending one of these YES students who was from the Palestinian territory to a small town in Pennsylvania, actually not that far from here. And we had had good success with a principal in that high school accepting kids from that program, and had a veteran host family. And the school board decided they wouldn't take the student. And we had placed kids there tons of time before. So I said, well, why is that? And he had placed on his visa documentation under country of origin, occupied Palestine. And the school board said, well, he's clearly going to be anti-Semitic, so we're not going to take him. And it was one of the moments I was most proud of YFU, because YFU fought in the press and said, this, at the base of what the organization stands for is bringing people of different cultures together to understand one another. And the principal was secretly sending us emails going, can't tell my school board no, but go. And they ultimately placed him, a kid named Rami. And Rami came and gave presentation at Rotary clubs and all sorts of things, did not express any anti-Semitic tendencies, and really, I think, not only understood better why that was a complicated issue for the world to grapple with, but I also think helped that small town understand that it just wasn't as black and white as our talking points. So Rami finishes his year, he goes back to the Palestinian territory, and his village is bombed. And we looked for him for 2 or so weeks via email, and finally connected with him, and he said to me, I don't understand how a country that I came to love as my second home could endorse policies like that. And I said, to the point of this Soft Power 30, I said, have you not realized that governments and people are different? And at the lens of governments, it's more complex, and or not. We get into black and white issues. At the level of people, do you still remember goodness? And if you can hang on to that, the world's got a shot. And his response was, I'll try, but it's hard. And for every one of those stories, or you learn that Finland is a fantastic country and does everything perfectly. No, so I think that is the power. It's not even in the exchange. We got so stuck on the mechanisms for exchange, but for every one of those stories, there were thousands in a given year of folks that came over and busted through stereotypes.
You should tell the story of the blind girl as well.
So there was a young woman who, on paper, was a perfect exchange student, excelled in school. Came from a decent family, wanted to come, had raised the money to come on exchange, but just happened to be 100% blind and 100% deaf. And I was really proud. Many of you know I'm a trustee at St. Bonaventure University, and called St. Bonaventure, and actually Emily Morris, our new VP of Communications, was working at St. Bonaventure at the time, and I said, I don't think we're going to be able to bring this young woman, and Olean, New York brought her, and New York State helped find a way for her to navigate that program. She had an amazing year. Her mom later reports that she's now thinking about all sorts of things, being a doctor, being a lawyer, being a scientist, whereas the initial request was, she's blind and deaf and will never do anything. And learned the generosity of her line. I never realized Americans were so generous, because what they heard politically in Romania was all the politics and all the playbooks, and will never be the same again.
Yeah, it's, I don't want to sound Pollyanna-ish up here, for those of you who remember that film from way back when, but this is not easy work. We as human beings, I think, we're very tribal by nature, and that has served us well evolutionarily, that we be tribal, that we tend to be supportive of our nuclear families and our immediate tribe or our nation, whatever it might be. And it's a stretch to go beyond that, to reach out and try to understand another, or even to understand your adversary. So I just want to say this is tough work, and whether it's a young teenager from the Palestinian territories or a blind teenager, these are, again, they're person by person experiences. This is hard to scale, this kind of a program, admittedly, though YFU has done it over our life, our 66-year lifespan. Over 300,000 students have had these experiences, and when you add in the host families, host parents, host siblings, other students at the schools where they studied, you're talking about an impact in the millions of human beings, which is pretty amazing. But it's done one student, one family, one high school at a time. But I think it's powerful. And again, I think the impact, it's delayed, right? I mean, teenagers aren't going to be going and doing anything too earth-shattering immediately out of high school. But slowly over decades, these folks who have had these experiences have accrued to all kinds of amazing positions and leadership positions in their countries. Diplomats or cabinet. We've had cabinet members or professors or whatever it might be. And believe me and trust me, we are feeling the positive impacts of that on a daily basis, but it's really hard to calculate on any spreadsheet. It's a bit of an article of faith to believe that these experiences ultimately have that soft diplomacy, peacemaking impact.
So critical to this mix that you talked about is school systems. And I think we all know, and we've studied at Chautauqua, the complexities of school systems, that state by state, county by county, it's different. Exchange organizations rely on schools to actually take students. We had the blessing of participating with a New York Times bestselling author on a book called The Smartest Kids in the World and How They Got There, that looked at world education systems through the lens of 3 exchange students, one of whom happened to be a YFU student, which was a lot of fun. She's now making a documentary on it using mostly YFU students, which will be great. But for folks that will go back to their communities and participate in school boards, or our teachers themselves or have kids, why do you think accepting international students into school systems matters? Why, I mean, you have kids that, one now in college, one still in high school. Why does it matter for you as a parent? Is it something that should be central to the way we think about education in the United States?
Absolutely. So I think, again, part of the power of these experiences is not just for the student involved, but they obviously touch many lives in the schools where they study, and other students in those schools benefit from that. My own kids have benefited from that in the Ann Arbor Public Schools, which frankly has been a very supportive school system, as you can imagine. The struggle, just to get back on school districts, because all of you perhaps can help in your own communities with this. I mean, it really varies. As you know, we have a very fractured educational hierarchy in this country, and most control is really locally within school districts. So all of them have different rules about how they approach and account for exchange students. And we're blessed in the state of Michigan that, at least up until now, the state of Michigan allows exchange students to count toward the head count for the per student allotment that the state government provides to public schools in the state of Michigan. But many school districts, many states do not do that. And then it really becomes a struggle for a school administrator to decide, is it worth it to bring this person, additional student or students into my school, and I'm not going to get any extra money for doing that. So that's a battle we fight, locality by locality, and I encourage all of you to help us perhaps fight that battle if you want to get involved locally with YFU. I have to make that pitch too before I leave. So and if any of you are interested in hosting a YFU student, we're actually right, as Michael knows, we're in the throes of what we call the placement season right now, because all of our incoming students to the United States need to be placed by August 31st per State Department regulations. So we're scrambling right now to find thousands of homes for these students. And if you're interested at all, maybe it's a little short notice this year, but certainly keep it in mind for the next cycle. It's a fabulous experience.
So you had an experience, actually your whole family had an experience, and so we talk about people-to-people engagement. Certainly there's a whole part of the State Department that believes this is critical to diplomacy. Talk to us about your journey through Cuba and what that meant for you and your family and what you thought before you went, and what you thought during and after. And if anyone wants to get it, I think I have video of his family almost on every minute of that trip.
So I should point out, so YFU's Bread and Butter program is this year-long immersive experience where you live with the family and go to high school, but we do have other short-term programs, short-term exchanges. We also have dabbled in adult study tours, which this Cuba trip would fall under. For the last couple of years, YFU has sponsored a trip to Cuba, and last summer, almost exactly right now, I think a year ago today, we were in Cuba. And my wife and 2 kids right here in the front row went with a group from YFU with Michael. And as you probably know, to travel to Cuba as an American, it still needs to be on a cultural or an educational tour. So I was honestly, not to put you kids on the spot, but I was a little worried about how my teenage kids would enjoy this trip, because this was not a let's go sit on the beach and play beach volleyball and that kind of thing. This was a trip where we actually had a government minder the entire time we were there, had lectures that were part of the trip, and I mind you, well, kind of like this, lectures without any air conditioning, except hotter. You're right, everything's relative, and it was even hotter, and we would be sometimes in enclosed spaces. I remember going to the museum of the literacy campaign, and it was oppressive. I mean, it was not the museum per se, but it was just so hot in there, and my kids soldiered through it. And I think, and I shouldn't speak for you guys, but I think it was quite an engaging experience. We went on the trip and we spent a few days in Miami first and explored around. And then you get on a plane for about 45 minutes. And what I think stood out to my kids, or what really came home, was the importance of institutions and political structures. And that, we sometimes forget that, I think, of how important the institutions and the structures that we have built as a society here in the United States are amazing. And sure, we have our disagreements, but these institutions are what save us at the end of the day, and Cuba doesn't have that. And it was readily apparent the consequences of that. And the poverty was breathtaking. The resilience of the Cuban people was inspiring, but, I think it really sent the message home loud and clear to my kids of the importance of really protecting these critical institutions and the freedom and the things we enjoy every day here in the United States. So on that level, I think it was a very powerful trip, even though it was only about 10 days.
Well, and you mentioned those institutions as part of what is a glue that holds us together. And we've been having a conversation and a dialogue at Chautauqua at a macro level about a breakdown in civility and how the country seems to be fractious. There seems to be a lesson in what I think the exchange industry has done, because it's brought kids from all over the world who couldn't be more different. What do you think the lessons are that we can pull into our own country that you've learned through YFU and exchange that can help us start to crack the code of why it is we struggle to talk to one another without screaming, and where are the lessons in how we help young people from different cultures assimilate, and vice versa, because we send American kids out as well. Where's the prescription for us in that?
So That's a really good question. And to go back to my opening comments about kind of what set me off on this journey of decades now in my life to reconcile these incredibly emotional differences we have within families, within societies, across the globe. And to try and understand what's at the core of those. And I'm going to make a plug for a book that I read a couple of years ago, and I think I recommended it to you, and you better have read it. Yep. But probably many of you in the audience, I hope, have read it, but it's called The Righteous Mind. And the subtitle is Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion. And it's by an author by the name of Jonathan Haidt, H-A-I-D-T, not H-A-T-E. But it really spoke to me. And his basic thesis in the book is that as much as we as human beings like to think we are rational and fact-based in our decision-making in life, we are not. We are still, at the core, intuitive beings. And we have knee-jerk reactions, emotional reactions to things. And then we use our rationality to kind of explain why we have that viewpoint. And obviously in today's world, we can all go find justification for why we have our particular viewpoint. And he, in that book, makes the case, and this resonates to me, that all of us have a complex moral structure that we figure out for ourselves. And some of that's impacted by our cultural upbringing. Some of it's just very personal. But he talks about 6 key moral, I guess I'll call them, attributes that each of us have kind of in different percentages and different, that's why it's so complex for human beings and we arrive at different conclusions. I think they are care, fairness, liberty, loyalty, let me get these right, authority, and sanctity.
From the teenage daughter,
No,
justice.
Well, maybe I got those wrong, but sanctity, again, like the sanctity of marriage, the sanctity of beings. And so again, fairness, care, liberty, loyalty, authority, and sanctity. That's what it is, that's right. But those are all kind of, there's some mutual conflict between those, right? I mean, we all value our liberty and our individual liberty, but that kind of conflicts with respecting authority, right? And this is where I think the core of conflict at a very interpersonal level within families or within cultures and their politics or across nations, I think it's very analogous. We all have this complex web of these moral underpinnings that prevent us, without real hard work on our part, from getting beyond them and being willing to reach out to an adversary and say, I want to understand you. You're a good person. Now, trust me, there are bad people in the world, but most people are pretty good people and are just struggling to make sense of the globe around them. But we all, again, come to different conclusions through our unique life experiences of how we kind of divvy up the percentages across those 6 very laudable and important attributes. But I think it's the core of our conflict that we each arrive at different conclusions about how to weight those different ones or different situations. You know, if you're particularly caring about fairness, you may see a situation very differently than someone who really thinks that loyalty is important. So to me, one of the big lessons of student exchange, and I think what I got as a student on student exchange, and Alan or others can tell me if I'm correct, that others get on student exchange, is this ability to realize I may not know everything, or I may not understand all of this, and I got to have a little humility and step back before I'm making judgments, either about this culture or about any given situation. And at the core, and I'm sorry I'm being a little preachy here, but this is the Hall of Philosophy. I think what we all in this country need, right, left, different religions, others, is a huge dose of humility. To realize no single human being, no single political party, no single organization, even Chautauqua, does not have all the right answers.
Well, hey now.
But I think if we approach the dialogue with that humility, that is a key first step. Because it suddenly gives you a different framework. And it gives you the ability to step back and go, wait, I really want to understand why, because you're a good person, there must be something in your own experience in life that tells you that's the way to view this. So humility, I think, is the word I will really push, that this is what and I think these international experiences, they by definition breed humility. I mean, to tell you about my time in Spain. I mean, my Spanish sucked when I went exchange. So I arrived in Spain in this family, and nobody spoke English. And you want to talk about a humbling experience. I mean, my first weeks, my time with the family, I mean, most of the time, I had no friggin' idea what we were doing next, right? All of a sudden, we're getting in the car and going somewhere, and like, okay, I guess I'll just go with the flow. But again, it was very humbling, but it really taught me something. It's like, well, just going with the flow generally works out okay. And and honestly, my best relationship early on in the family was with the 5-year-old granddaughter, because she was the one I could speak at her level and kind of follow things. And again, that was a humbling, well, maybe the dog, too. But that was a humbling experience. But again, I think I hope I carry those traits to this day. Not always. And my wife is looking at me like, oh, yeah, right. But I think that's why these experiences, and it doesn't even have to be international. We often, not even jokingly, talk about within YFU, maybe we need to start doing some exchanges within our country. I mean, if you take a kid raised in Manhattan in New York City and, maybe they made a movie about this called City Slickers, but, put them out in some rural ranch or something out in Colorado. I mean, we have someone from the deep south to the north, et cetera. We could use some of these exchanges ourselves.
Yeah, absolutely. So last question before we open it up for our friends that have assembled on a muggy day. If organizations like YFU succeed, what does the world look like? We've been talking with the CSIS folks all week, and you mentioned a somewhat scary prescription. My comment to them privately was, thank you for the gloom and doom. Is there hope in the world? And all of them came around to say there is hope in the world. How does this play a role if the mission of YFU or the mission of Chautauqua takes off and really succeeds?
Again, I think forums like this, I think student exchange are just critically important work. And generally, this kind of work is done by nonprofits. Michael and I spent some time, we actually went to a program at the Harvard Business School on nonprofits. It was very enlightening. And they said at the outset of that experience, nonprofits take on the tough work. There's no money to be made at these kind of things. And, that's why many of the world's toughest problems get tackled by nonprofits. Yet, as a society, I don't think we put enough emphasis or really provide enough moral, financial, other intellectual support to how our nonprofits are run and the kind of talent that get attracted to nonprofits. I remember when we were doing a presentation, I think nonprofits, someone don't check this, but it's I think roughly like 5.5% of our gross national product is represented by nonprofits, and about 10% of employment, which makes sense because nonprofits don't pay very well. But I think we really, as a society, have to support the work, not just of YFU or Chautauqua, but of all these nonprofits, really tackling the tough challenges, whether they're in healthcare or education. And I think not only just give, but give of time and experience, because nonprofits often, by definition, because they're struggling to make ends meet, often don't have the best, logistical or management or operational skills. So, I'm going off from your question, but to veer back, how's the world look? I think I'm very hopeful. Despite all the problems we have as a globe, you look back at human history, and it's fitful progress, but it's generally progress. It's 2 steps forwards, 1 step back. But I remain hopeful that we are making progress as human beings. We are figuring out ways to truly understand each other, and places like YFU, I think, play an important role.
Well, and just a reminder, you said the nonprofit sector, that also happens because people like you and folks in the audience volunteer. The incredible amount of volunteerism that sustains nonprofits is intense. So Maureen told me that when the bell chimed, we should be wrapping up, so I'm grateful to have kind of hit that cue almost, Mo. Pretty close. But thank you, and in Chautauqua tradition, we're happy to answer questions. Really appreciate it.
Michael's answering all the tough ones.
No.
David Brooks spoke here 7 years ago on the subject of leadership, and one of the major qualities in a leader was humility. which you touched on. If you would expand on that a little bit. And also and you kind of touched on this too, are there parallel programs like this that are being done at an adult level in any way among people that would also help, not just at the youth level? So if you would address those two issues, please.
Yeah, that'd be great. So let me do the first one before I forget. So at the adult level, ironically, a program housed right in the same headquarters building as YFU in Washington, D.C. is called Atlas Corps. And it's basically an adult exchange program that places adults in, essentially, I guess you'd call them internship positions with organizations around the globe, and they get an immersive experience through working at usually a nonprofit, is that right? But also experiencing another culture and living and working in that culture. So that's one example, but I'm sure there are others. Back to the other question, I guess, about the role of humility, or this is going to be a little bit different, but let me give you an example from my own career where I think that quality really helped me. And as I look back at my career, I realize I've often played the role of a change agent, and I think effective change agents know and come into situations with humility, and that ends up making you able to get more done. And I'm going to give you a concrete example back in my days when I was working as a commercial banker. I was working for First Chicago, and I have to go back in my bank scorecard and remember what the bank was called before all these mergers since, but it was First Chicago Bank in Chicago at that point. And I was on I had been a commercial banker for many years, but then my own background's in industrial and operations engineering, and they had a special project at the bank when First Chicago merged with the former National Bank of Detroit, and they were doing what's called the strategic sourcing project to figure out how they could more efficiently develop vendor relationships and negotiate contracts and improve operations between the two now merged organizations. So one of the projects I was put on was to work with, at that point we had 3 data centers, one in Detroit, one in Chicago, and one out in Elgin, Illinois, where the First Card, at that point the credit card division, had their data center. So these were the nerve centers of the bank, right? They were running, millions of transactions every day, and a lot was on the line with those. And my job, as one of the internal consultants on the strategic sourcing project, was to work with those data center managers to evaluate their vendor contracts and see if we could save money and make a switch to a different vendor. So I remember going to the first meeting with these 3 data center managers, and they were all, at that point, run on IBM equipment, and they had IBM service contracts that were incredibly expensive. But I get into the meeting, and these 3 data center managers basically go, "That's fine, Daryl, we'll go through this exercise, but we're not switching from IBM. There's no way we're switching from IBM. So whatever, we'll play along with you and do whatever analysis you have to do." So in those kind of situations, you have to be, if you're not humble, if you come in as the hotshot consultant who knows better and says, "Well, what are you talking about? We got to we're doing this. We got to save money." It ended up being, with a humble approach, what I really did was I really sat down with these guys and understood their concerns. Why was their knee-jerk reaction to we're staying with IBM? And it wasn't an irrational reaction. There were very rational reasons why they wanted to stay with their comfortable vendor, the one they knew. I'm pretty proud of my career. Guess what? They switched their maintenance contracts to a company called Storage Tech. To this day, I'm amazed I actually got that done. But it was because of that humility up front to realize these guys aren't crazy. There's probably a reason they feel that strongly about that. And at the end of the day, maybe they were right. As it turned out, we did end up switching and saving money and actually getting, I think, a more effective service contract. But to me, I'm very off topic, but that's a great example, I think, of approaching tough situations, seemingly intractable situations, with humility. You'd be amazed what you can get done.
Out of about a 33-year career in campus ministry at 3 major universities, I want to make us aware of another untapped reservoir of potential dialogue, because this program is so important, and that is on all of our major campuses, there are thousands of international students that have come from other countries. And we've tried to work at places at Youngstown State University to bring people from the community to dialogue with these students. It's tough to do because, as we said, we get kind of hidebound into our own kinds of things, and to do something like that, it sounds like almost an adventure. But ways to learn from another student, and that student to learn from us as we exchange our ideas about our countries and our perspectives about things. That's a very important thing to do. So go back home, get to your church or a council of churches or some other group, and find some people that want to go to the university and say, we'd like to initiate some dialogue now between citizens and international students at the university. And they'll be glad to talk with you.
Thanks.
Yeah, you're here, so we'll go.
Thank you. I have long thought that if our government would spend some of its military funds, and other governments do likewise, to put Jewish children and Muslim children together and send them around the world in groups for at least a year on an educational tour, that in the end, we eventually wouldn't have to spend so much for military, perhaps even Sunni and Shia students. But I'm wondering if that's Pollyannish to think that parents would allow that and that funds could be raised to do that.
Yeah, there's actually organizations that are doing that on a minor scale, not sending them around the world, but bringing young people of very disparate cultures, or young people who are the representatives of intractable global strife together. And they've found just what you've discovered, or similar to the story I told about Rami at the beginning, that what separates people is preconceived notions about stereotypes and or the assumption that you know what the other is thinking. And it's why these programs are so critical to the notion of soft diplomacy, but it works. And we used to dream because, as Daryl indicated, youth exchange is not a high profit yield margin, and staying open to do this transformative work was tough. And we used to say, just give us one missile, and we could change the world.
What's the name of those organizations?
I can get them for you.
Okay.
There's an organization that's about 10 years old that's been doing it in the United States, bringing large groups of Palestinian and Jewish kids together, and they spend a week to 2 weeks together. And they're really smart about it. It's slow integration. It's not just let's throw you all in a room and see what happens. But it's really breaking down and helping, in particular, young people understand that young people are young people. I mean, it's at the basis of what we were working on was if you could get a person before they form such hard stereotypes about the other, they've actually got a shot at global poverty and educational inequality and all sorts of other stuff.
Thank you.
My name is Ellis Coling. I'm a retired professor at North Carolina State. And I'd just like to offer a testament about the value of what you are doing, encouraging young people to go abroad and learning how the world really is. I was a bit retarded in my chance to study abroad. I waited till I was a postdoc. And my wife was not wishing to spend her time just waiting around for me in my laboratory. So she got a job through the American Embassy with the Royal Board of Education. And she traveled to 22 different school systems all over Sweden. And one of the students that she had from Katrineholm was eager to come to America. So she became an exchange student. We brought her back from Sweden. And she called us to say, I want to come back again. And we brought her to Chautauqua last summer. And she had a wonderful introduction to what Karen Armstrong and others here have taught us, for example, about what the meaning of the word jihad means and the way that that's been prostituted in American media. But I congratulate you both for what you do to allow for people, young people who are not yet fixed in their minds, to be exposed to how things are abroad, and to give a much deeper understanding of what their parents meant to them, what this country can provide for them, and to make this a better country, both in our life here in America and in all the other countries where, and there's two things that you mentioned about modesty. I'd love to have a conversation with you about the importance of modesty. And you also mentioned that that nonprofit organizations are 5% of the GDP. I think a lot about what GDP means, and I never heard that it was 5% of the GDP of America is generated by. You have brought very interesting insights to my life. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. You're welcome.
I am curious as to whether or not the immigration bans have had, or you anticipate them having an effect on bringing young people from Muslim countries here for your program.
I mean, so far we haven't noticed that much of a decline in the demand to come into the United States, but we as a board have been worried about this because I think there's just no question they've made America look a little less welcoming. But we have not seen it yet, but we are concerned about it, that's for sure.
Yes, this is Bill Flanders. I really want to just take a moment for a brief testimonial to the exchange program. In Chautauqua, the program AFS was brought here by a neighbor who was traveling to Europe. He happened to be sitting next to someone from the diplomatic corps, and he was saying, how can any individual just have any influence on what is happening in the world? And he said, well, there are small programs starting that have more influence than many of our diplomatic things. I had a student from Japan. He was 6 months old when the bomb went off. He was from Hiroshima. He was just over the mountain. He was not injured. And he came the year of the Kennedy assassination. He was absolutely glued to the television, as we all were. After he had finished college back in Japan, he went into the diplomatic corps. The Japanese government sent him to Princeton School of Economics to train him as a Japanese diplomat. He came back. He was in the UN delegation. He was in charge of U.S.-Japanese defense treaty. He was in charge of U.S. diplomatic trade. He became ambassador to South Africa. He was ambassador to Korea. He was one of the 3 top diplomats finally before he retired in Japan. So yes, individuals can have a big effect with these exchange programs. And I really hope that you will influence anyone that you meet, that this is one way that you can really influence international affairs. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi, I've noticed the men all give their names and the women don't, so I will say I am Sue Tannehill, which means nothing to you. I have 2 interrelated questions. The first is that as a teacher at the University of Buffalo, I've noticed that my students do a lot of international gaming. I have one student who in fact paid his tuition by selling at $5 a pop a patch that would allow you to level up in some video game, and he was selling them all over the world. So the first question is, does that also play into that, or is that just too narrow because it's meeting somebody from another country on a very narrow dimension? The second thing is very casually you mentioned virtual exchange, and what I'm imagining is weekly Skypes with somebody from Yemen, but at least for me, I didn't understand enough about what that was, and I'm very curious to have you explain that.
The first, I'll take the second.
Yeah.
Thank you.
I'm sorry, what was the first?
The first was about gaming.
Oh, yeah, gaming. Listen, and I've got 2 teenagers of my own. Whatever will excite and attract a teenager to want to have any kind of an experience at this level, I think is a good thing. I think it's actually something I need to take back to our board to think about gaming as a entry-level drug or something to our exchange opportunities. So again, I think it's obviously there's a gradation of the impact of any given interaction, but I'm a firm believer any interaction that gets you outside of your comfort zone and interacting with people that maybe are different than you or have a different viewpoint than you May not be easy, but it can help. But gaming's a pretty safe ground probably to do that, and so why not? And I'll let you handle the one about how we structure the virtual exchange.
Yeah, so one of the things, a daily staffer asked me the other day what I was most proud about in my time at YFU, and one of the things that I was most proud of is we started virtual exchanges when I was president. And it actually came out of a real great tragedy, which was the death of Ambassador Chris Stevens. And when he was killed in Libya, his family got together with the Bezos Foundation and the Aspen Institute and donated $40 million to help virtual exchanges, again, with the belief that if young people from different cultures understood one another, that might reduce hatred and violence in the world, and maybe some of these things wouldn't have happened. And I think, like the questioner, we initially thought, gosh, are they just going to be Skyping or texting each other? The early tests on this were remarkable, and I'll share one story to illustrate the point. Technology, fortunately, has caught up, and YFU uses or is moving toward a Google Classroom type of a setup where there's direct interaction. But you've got a couple different issues in there. You've got teenagers, so we have to protect identity and anonymity, and yet teenagers don't want to be locked down so much that they can't chat. Again, I have a 18-year-old who lives on this, and if we put lots of strictures in front of that, the exchange isn't going to happen. The power actually happens in storytelling. So one of the most powerful things that our director of virtual exchanges came down and said was that there was a woman in Tunisia who asked her counterpart in America, I think it was somewhere like Iowa, and the young woman in Iowa was actually from a family of Muslim descent. And she said, have you ever worn traditional Muslim garb? And the young woman said, no, I haven't. And she said, well, will you do me a favor? Will you wear something traditional to school tomorrow? And the young woman did, and reported back through a series of video chats and other things that while normally popular at school, she had been spit on, kicked, and called slurs. And her response to the young woman in Tunisia was, I understand Islamophobia and hatred for the first time. And the response from Tunisia was, I don't feel alone for the first time. And those are the interactions that we're trying to create. And I'm really proud of YFU, and this is not something I did. There's a dynamic young woman named Erin Helland, who's actually the author of this soft power article in here, who has worked with educators on creating a curriculum. And it starts with a basis of understanding and level setting, then dialogue, then picking apart what's within that dialogue, and allowing young people to, in some ways, curate their own conversations with bumpers on it. And so what virtual exchanges really are is a safe room to help kids understand they're more alike than different. Much like I said to all of you that I believe what we do in 9 weeks will be the purest manifestation of a Chautauqua ideal, I believe a year-long exchange is our best shot at soft diplomacy. But if those things aren't going to happen for a young person for a whole host of reasons, I'm happy to give them a safe room to realize that they're more alike than different to other kids in the world. And so that's the premise. And it's got a lot of work to go, a lot of work.
Hi, my name is Carol Collins, and I live in Western New York, and this is my world, what you're talking about. The other 10 months of the year that I'm not here, we've hosted 8 foreign exchange year-long students, and I'm the sponsored program coordinator for the Western New York AFS students. So when you say the yes students are your favorites, yeah, they're mine too. They come over here, they're extremely motivated to do well, to learn everything they can, to do as much community service as they can, to learn about how our government works and so on and so forth. But the little commercial I want to give right now is it's very difficult to find host families, as you know, with YFU. We can bring it home, though, to Chautauqua. And because we inside this fence are culturally very, very different from those outside the fence. And CLSC Alumni Association has raised a fair good amount of money to sponsor 6-day, 1-week scholarships for local Chautauqua County high school students. We brought 8, there will be, have brought 8 in here this summer. Over the course of the summer. I encourage you all, 6 days is not a big deal to host a local high school student from Sherman or Clymer or Jamestown. The program had just started about 4 years ago. The first 2 years, they only had 2 students in here each year, and then it went to 5 last year. This year it's 8, so we're hoping it will grow, but we need families to please open up their homes and show those kids that are outside the gate that we're not such bad people in here, and we're not, inclusive or exclusive, I guess. Contact CLSC, or I'm the person actually, but if you don't have my contact information, but contact CLSC if you would be willing. You can be a renter. You don't have to be a homeowner. I had renters of mine who hosted 2 Kids Week too. So let me just throw that out to everybody.
Thank you for that.
Yeah, no, that's great. And for those of you without a scorecard, because we're throwing around initials, but AFS is basically YFU and AFS are like the Macy's and Gimbels of the high school age student exchange market. Both excellent organizations, and even though we are kind of competitors, I think we all really believe in the cause. And basically AFS and YFU do the same kind of programming. So yeah, either organization is a great one to get involved with.
Hi, I'm Doug Asbury. I'm a retired United Methodist minister, and I want to mention the East-West Divan Orchestra that Daniel Barenboim has formed to bring Israeli and Palestinian musicians together as a way to break down divides. I was the beneficiary of the Institute of European Studies when I was in my junior year in college, and their program in Vienna, Austria, where I didn't have to know German to study there, but I learned German, and the Institute took us on tours of much of Europe and exposed us to a great deal, and had wonderful guides to help us learn about the cultures that we were passing through. So I want to affirm the kinds of things you've been doing. I have done some PhD studies, and my focus is kind of what Brene Brown is doing on a more secular level, but the question of shame and of humility. And I look at the Adam and Eve story and suggest that before they actually ate the fruit, they experienced shame of thinking that there was something wrong with them that they could do something about. And that something about it was to violate the command of God not to eat of the fruit. But out of that same place that we feel shame and try to remedy it ourselves, we can also respond to the sense that there's something inadequate about us through humility. Humility, in contrast with shame, shame says, I'm not worth anything, but I can make myself worth something. Humility says, I don't have everything, but I've got something. And I'm wondering to what degree YFU stresses the gifts, not only that the host families have to offer and the host communities have to offer, but also the gifts that the students themselves bring to the new place.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I always found so fascinating about the privilege of sitting inside an organization like YFU that receives a couple thousand kids every year is to see how young people show up. And I think some of the greatest challenges we had, and it's not a mistake that YFU has in essence, a counseling team on staff. I mean, they're called support service managers, is because kids from lots of different cultures come with different definitions of humility and shame. And it's fascinating to watch. Daryl knows in my first year, we had a tragedy with a young person from Japan who had experienced a not good experience here, and remember wrestling with the culture of counseling was not seen as something honorable in his family. And what do you do with that? I think the dynamics of organizations like YFU is finding that sweet spot of honoring cultures and honoring individuals, and like every teenager, that conflict of humility and shame, I think, showed up in every one of these kids at some point or another. And we wrestle with it all the time.
Yeah, you really got me thinking now about that way of looking at shame and humility as potentially different sides of a coin or something. And I think that's fascinating. I think you're right that, well, more disclosure, I grew up a Lutheran, a Missouri Synod Lutheran, for those of you who we used to call it the Missouri Synod. Very conservative Lutheranism, and shame played a big part, I think, in my upbringing, and I think that's part of my journey as well, has been maybe moving from shame to humility, because I think you raise a good point, and that, again, I think can help fight conflict in our homes, in our nations, and across nations, is to move toward humility where you do feel worth. By having the humility to say, I don't have all the answers, doesn't mean you don't have some of the answers. And that's very different than feeling shame, like I'm just not worth anything, and what do I know? And I think getting toward more of that end of the spectrum is where all of us probably need to be heading. And again, we got to end here, but I'll just end with that. Intercultural exchanges, I think, maybe can just be a great vehicle to really jumpstart that kind of a journey.
You've got the last one.
Hello, my name is Holly Sullivan, and I am a YFU alum. When I was 17, I was chosen to go to Montevideo, Uruguay. I had to practically get out a map to know where it was. I was hoping to go to Spain or somewhere else, but it turned out to be a life-changing experience for me. The family I lived with down there, the daughter, my sister, I had been a YFU exchange student in Michigan, as had her boyfriend, who became her husband. And we still communicate. She's been here many times. I go back there once in a while, whenever I can. But I only found YFU because my older sister had been an AFS student. And how it goes was, if one person in the family was, the next person couldn't be. So my mother found YFU for me. But how do people find YFU? And I don't think there's a chapter around here, and what can we do to get one started?
No, I mean, you've hit on the crux of a problem for a nonprofit, right? Is we don't have huge communications budgets or marketing budgets, so it's a struggle. Frankly, I thank Michael. Part of why I'm here is to spread the gospel of YFU and hopefully inspire some of you to get involved with us. And you can certainly contact me or Michael if you want to know who a local YFU rep is in your region of the country. But it's a struggle. I mean, again, not just for YFU or AFS, it's a struggle for nonprofits again. I think we undervalue the work they do, and we leave them with not many tools to get it done, even though they're often the most pressing challenges for our society and civilization. So whether it's YFU or AFS or whatever nonprofit or cause really inspires you, and I know many of you here already do this, but just get involved. And this is something I drill into my kids all the time, that, you know, service is a part of your life mission. You need to pay the bills, you need to have a career, but at the end of the day, we need to give back with our skills as well. So thank you for sharing your experience in Uruguay, and thank all of you.
And two last thoughts, yfuusa.org for more information, but to prove that YFU shows up in my life in tons of places, bringing it back to Chautauqua, Obie Felton and I are chatting on the back porch of the AMP, and she said, you know, and I'm here and this is great, and then we're going to go to Albany. I said, why are you going to Albany? She said, well, I'm actually going to visit my host family because I was here on exchange from Germany. And I said, oh, what organization? She said, I'm sure you've never heard of it, YFU. And I said, well, just happened to be president before I got here. So thank you for letting me share this love of mine for Chautauqua with another love of mine, YFU, and my dear friend Daryl, and welcome him to Chautauqua.